Hi, everybody. Think we've still got people coming in. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for our What Matters to the Regions in conversation with Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute's webinar. Thanks, Richard, for joining us. Really appreciate it. I would like to kick off our session this afternoon by acknowledging, well, certainly that a number of us are coming presently on Whadjuk Noongar Boodja, but I know, because this is to the regions, that you are on many different First Nations people's land. I'd like to ask you to join me in paying our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this land is stolen land. It was never ceded. And as a nation, we have a lot of unfinished business. I also take this opportunity to acknowledge that many First Nations peoples are still very strongly impacted by the result of the referendum. And as WACOS, we are committed to keeping on working on First Nations issues and to address our unfinished business. I would really like to thank Richard for being with us today. Richard, as many of you know, is the Executive Director of the Australia Institute. He is a prominent economist, author and public policy commentator, and a former Associate Professor in the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU. He's the author of several books, including Economobabble, Curing Affluenza, Dead Right, How Neoliberalism Ate Itself, and What Comes Next, and Big, and the Role of the State in the Modern Economy. Richard is a fantastic commentator on issues that impact us, particularly those working in the social justice space, and I'm really excited to hand over to you, Richard.
Thanks so much, Rachel, and thanks everyone for coming along today. I'm just going to talk for about 20 minutes or so, aren't I, Rach? Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And then we'll go to questions.
Excellent. So, and if Rachel, you want to kind of steer me off back onto course if I get too abstract, you feel free to do that at any time.
Will do.
So let me just start. Thank you for the welcome to country, and I acknowledge the Indigenous owners, past and present and emerging. And I just think you can't talk about regional disparity and regional inequality, and in turn you can't talk about inequality in Australia without taking an Indigenous perspective. So let me just give you a few simple numbers, and then I'll tell you a bit of a story. 62% of Indigenous people live outside, in Western Australia, 62% of Indigenous people live outside metropolitan Perth. So the vast majority of people from WA live in Perth. The majority of Indigenous people don't live in Perth. Indigenous West Australians experience a significant gap in life expectancy, 13.4 years for men and 12 years for women. And of course, unfortunately, as we know, Indigenous West Australians have a 3 times higher mortality rate for children. Now, I'm not going to read statistics at you for 20 minutes, but I want to start with those, because when we talk about economics, we talk about indicators for how the economy is going, we often really get caught up, or the people talking about the data really get caught up in how the data was put together rather than the story it means. And things like averages can really cause lots of problems, because when we talk about the average experience, we talk about average wages, we talk about the unemployment rate across WA, all of that data defined by average, by definition, conceals the distribution. By definition, it conceals what's going on. So to give you a simple example, if you're watching the news, at the end of the news, they'll put up a map of Australia and they'll tell you what the weather's going to be like in Perth, where I am today, in Canberra, where I was yesterday, in Darwin, in Tasmania. And the thing you never see when you're watching the weather on the news is what the average temperature in Australia is going to be. No one talks about what the average rainfall across Australia will be. No one talks about what the average wind speed across Australia will be tomorrow, because those numbers would be meaningless. Who cares what the average temperature is in Australia tomorrow? If I'm in Canberra, I want to know what the weather is so I know whether I need a jumper, whether I need a hat, whether I need an umbrella. And if I live in Darwin, I want to know what affects me there. So when we talk about something that people really engage with and care about, like the weather, we always customize the data in ways that are meaningful for people. And we don't say that there's a particular threat of bushfires across all of Australia tomorrow. We talk about the particular areas where that threat is. Why? So that people in that area can take special care, and because people that are trying to solve those problems, hopefully emergency services, are thinking about where they need to deploy their resources. So we get it. We know that to understand the world we live in, we often need to describe different parts of the world in different ways. But when we talk about things like income or unemployment or educational performance, the minute we start talking about the average, we're going to hide, we're going to conceal, we're going to brush away all of the distinctions between the experience for different people in different places. And this is radically important if we're interested in trying to help those who need it most, and if we're trying to track progress towards improvement, or even if we just are interested in inequality and fairness, and we want to make sure that resources are going to where they are the most. So I know that's kind of obvious, but so much of what, for example, journalists or ministers or the public service will talk about is average going up. So what is it that you're worried about? So let me just give you a really simple way to remember why averages are always a bit silly. The average Australian has less than 2 legs. The average Australian has less than 2 legs. Why? Well, because the number of people with no legs or 1 leg is a lot greater than the number of people with 3 legs or 4 legs. So everyone knows that averages kind of conceal things, but when it comes to policy, we don't design anything for the average Australian. We don't design staircases for the average Australian. We don't design ramps or lifts for the average Australian. We look at the lived experience of different people and what their needs are. And for people with 2 legs that function, then we treat them like one group. And then for people who, for whatever reason, they need a wheelchair or they're just not that mobile, we come up with solutions custom made to help them. But we never design staircases or ramps for the average Australian. We're always thinking about the individual and what their needs might be. We might not always meet those needs, but we're not focused on the average. So back to a few simple numbers. I'm from Canberra, so apologies for my lack of awareness of all the subtlety of your geography, but I have pulled out some data to give you a sense of this. So I'm comparing here, and I'm using census data. Someone correct me if I'm pronouncing it wrong. Coorow, C-O-O-R-O-W, Coorow. I'm comparing Coorow and Cottesloe. And when we look at the average household income, in Cottesloe, average household income is more than twice that of Coorow. The average, well, guess what? It's kind of in the middle there, a bit closer to Coorow than Cottesloe. Similarly, if we look at what people spend their money on in Coorow and Cottesloe, then we see that in Coorow, if we look at household income, people are far more likely in Coorow to be spending their money, a large percentage of their money, on simple things like energy, and far less of their money on things like holidays. You know this, but again, if we look at the average for Western Australia, we're just describing what an imaginary West Australian is doing. The average West Australian doesn't exist. There's people that are spending a lot of money on holidays. There's people that are spending no money on holidays. Talking about how much the average West Australian spends on holidays just doesn't help us. Similarly, if we look at, again, comparing Kuro and Cottesloe, we find that in Kuro, 43% of people leave school at year 11 or below, whereas 43%, whereas in Cottesloe it's 11%. Now, if we want to do things like increase school retention, or if we're going to focus on indicators like sending people to university, do we care about the geographic distribution of who's staying on or who's going to university? Or as a society, we're just happy if more people from the most advantaged communities go to university and there's no change in parts of Western Australia where education is already not doing so well. So I don't want to bombard you with any more statistics. I guess I'm trying to make a different point. The point I'm trying to make is that whenever we're using statistics, we really need to be aware not just of how they're put together, but the choices that people make when they're presenting them to us. And that is, if we're going to, it's the minute someone says, don't worry, on average, West Australians are getting better, what they've really said is, don't dig into the detail here. We don't really care if the lowest income West Australians are doing well or not. Now, to give you a sense of proportion, and apologies, I caught up with some of you this morning, but not most of you. I can't help but say this. I say it in nearly every talk I give. Australia is one of the richest countries in the world, and we live at one of the richest points, or the richest point in world history. West Australia is a very high-income state in a high-income country. To give you a sense of how rich Australia is, Australia has a population the size of Singapore, but it has a continent the size of North America. In terms of GDP, in terms of national income, while Australia has one of the smallest populations in the world, we are the 13th richest economy in the world, not per capita, in the world. So we have enormous wealth, but unlike a lot of other rich countries, we don't redistribute that wealth nearly as much. So while we're one of the richest countries in the world, we're also one of the least equal countries in the developed world. So the OECD, the Rich Countries Club, of which we're a founding member, there's all sorts of data looking at the disparity between rich and poor across countries. And while Australia likes to call itself the land of the fair go, you know, it's all about mateship and pulling together. If you look at how we actually distribute income, if you look at how we collect tax, if you look at how and where we spend money, well, the reality is we are at the nasty end of the spectrum. Now, of course, there's nothing in the Constitution that says we should be nice. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that we should help those who need it. There's nothing in the Constitution that says we should provide high quality services to people in remote and regional parts of the country. These are just democratic choices. These are choices that we get to make every time we vote. These are choices we get to make every time we interact or choose not to interact with our elected representatives. It's up to us as a nation whether we want to do something about this or not. But to give you a sense of the magnitude of this, most people watching will probably think, well, it'd be nice to spend more on health, or nice to spend more on education, or nice to spend more investing in communications infrastructure in regional areas. Maybe we should do something about the crisis for women fleeing domestic violence. There's lots of things we could spend money on. But Australia, one of the richest countries in the world, is about to spend $300 billion on tax cuts, the stage 3 tax cuts, the vast majority of which will go to the highest income Australians. $300 billion worth of tax cuts. No economic modelling, no strong economic case, just because we want to. We're about to spend $350 billion on nuclear submarines that we didn't even know we needed a few years ago. And I use this quote all the time. When Josh Frydenberg was asked, can we afford the submarines? He said, if it's a priority, we can always afford it. And he's right. He's absolutely right. That's how rich we are. Hey, Treasurer, How about a lazy $350 billion to buy some nuclear submarines? Sure, done. How come it doesn't work when we want free childcare for working parents? How come it doesn't work when we want to spend more money to close the gaps identified in our education system? The answer is because the people with the constitutional power to fix it don't want to. And in order to conceal their choices, they take the conversation into much stranger territory, including things like talking about how the average is going up or how one group is doing well, when in reality, just like when we look at the weather map, we look at what's the bit I care about, what's happening in the part of Australia I care about. Well, when we're looking at things like poverty, when we're looking at things like educational performance, when we're looking at things like life expectancy, just like that weather map, we have to look at the parts of the country where part might refer to a geographic region, or part might be to a demographic group, or part might be looking at Indigenous outcomes versus non-Indigenous outcomes. Just like when we're focused on the weather map, we need to focus on the bit we care about, then we need to do that when we're looking at policy. And we need to do that when we're saying, is this good enough? Now, I know that's easy for me to say and hard for some of you to act on. It's hard to tell the journalists they've got it wrong and the minister they've got it wrong. But until we learn to tell the story of how the distribution, demographic distribution, geographic distribution, whichever, until we get good at telling those stories, they're going to keep telling stories that suggest that a rising tide will lift all boats, or a growing economy will give us the wealth we need to solve insert problem here. So they've got all these fairy tales that basically keep saying, we can just keep doing what we're doing, and one day the resources will flow to you. So sit up straight, be polite, tuck your shirt in, don't spill your food, and one day, if you're polite enough, the benefits of economic growth will trickle down to you. Well, that's not how the submarines got their 350 billion, and that's not how high income earners got their 300 billion. And unfortunately, I don't think it's how we're ever going to do things like actually make serious improvements in child poverty, or actually make serious changes to Indigenous disadvantage. Because unfortunately, this isn't fair. It is up to people like us on the call today to call this out, to demand change and to get a change in our priorities. That's the hard part. That's the bad news. The good news is, and I mean this, at the Australia Institute, we do a lot of polling, we talk to a lot of people, including a lot of politicians. There's no large constituency that wants more inequality in Australia. There's no large constituency that wants to make regional or demographic inequality worse. The overwhelming majority of Australians do actually want to solve the problems that I think most people on this call want to solve. The skill, the trick of those in power is to somehow convince the large majority of people that want to fix these problems that either they don't need fixing because they're going to fix themselves, or we will fix them. We just have to fix these other problems first. So I think I might wrap up there if that's all right, Rach. But yeah, very, very happy to take questions. And I can send some slides with some data around that I referred to before. But yeah, rather talk to people about ideas than get too stuck in the data. But happy to share my slides.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions before I jump in? Just checking. I've just had somebody in the chat say that yes, they would love the data. I've also someone's still digesting. So I'm going to jump in, Richard, with a broad question, which is when we do our state budget submission, and on other occasions, we get out and we visit regional Western Australia, up from Kununurra, Broome, Geraldton, down to Albany, Esperance, and Kalgoorlie. And there are some, while issues obviously vary in various areas, what we see consistently is lack of housing, lack of services, but particularly also really troubles with finding workforce, particularly in our social service areas, and also lack of access to childcare. And they sort of form a vicious circle. We can't get childcare workers, for example, because they can't get housing. You can't get housing because there's not enough housing. So, and if you can get housing, you can't get enough childcare workers anyway. If someone's coming in for a service, they can't get childcare because we can't get workers. So it's sort of like this vicious circle. How do we start dealing with these issues for the regions where we've got such fundamental issues?
Yeah, look, great question. So on the childcare, and Rachel, I've just sent you a document. It's not my slides. It's a 2-page document with a bunch of the data in there. I'm happy for you to share that before or after, or during or after the talk. But with childcare, for example, in Kuro, again, there's 0.2 childcare places per 1,000 people. In Cottesloe, there's 0.34. So almost 50% more childcare per 1,000 people in a high-income part of WA than in a low-income part. For housing, 8% of people in Kuro have got unmet housing need. In Cottesloe, 2.4%. So, 3 times higher when it comes to unmet need for housing in one part of WA compared to the average or to an advantaged suburb relatively like Cottesloe. So yeah, it's really hard to answer your question because it is such a good question. We're kind of trained to think in a very neoliberal way about what's the intervention with the highest benefit cost ratio, or what's the silver bullet? What's more important? Should we be, is childcare the thing we need most, or is it better schools, or is it making sure that no kid goes to school hungry? What does the data say? What's the thing we need to do? What the data really says is you need to do all of those things. And while each of them will make an improvement, the sum will be greater, the whole will be greater than the sum of its parts. That what we know is that, kids that grow up in high-income households that never go to school hungry, that get, high-quality teaching at home, maybe some tutoring after school, who, play sport with their friends and feel confident within themselves when they're at school. Which one of those things is why they're doing well in education? Well, guess what? It's all of those things. So, I still haven't quite answered your question, but we have to understand that when we're looking at areas with significant disadvantage, particularly in parts of regional Australia, because there is a compounding effect of these multiple shortages, a shortage of often food, a shortage of high quality housing, a shortage of attention from teachers or medical interventions. Each of them make other parts of the system harder. So what do we need? Well, we need to actually offer high quality services across our communities, wherever people happen to live. And that's not going to be cheap. And unfortunately, I think the really hard bit for people to get their heads around is, if we're actually going to close these gaps, either between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, or just remote and urban Australians, if we're going to close these gaps, it's going to take time and quite a lot of money. And in doing that, in trying to do that, there's going to be a whole bunch of people saying we don't have time or we don't have a lot of money. Well, we do have a lot of money. I just explained $650 billion worth of bad ideas, and that was just 2. We do have a lot of money. We can throw it at it. Well, these things will take time. So we can debate the order in which we make these interventions, but we're going to need to do lots of things differently. And we can afford it. We just need the political will to do it.
Thank you. Now, I have started seeing quite a lot of messages coming in on the chat. So I'll go with Nancy first, and that is, are there any examples of collaborative or collective efforts models that have successfully tackled some key socioeconomic issues in regional communities in the absence of large injections of money?
Yeah, absolutely. And West Australia is a real star in this regard. At the beginning of the COVID epidemic, the engagement between Indigenous communities and the health authorities to come up with, really evidence-based, locally specific, culturally appropriate interventions was really world-leading. And I think West Australia has a lot to be proud of there. And it's interesting because at the time, because it was such a big shock, and when COVID showed up, because so many bureaucrats admitted they didn't know what to do, because so many politicians admitted they didn't know what to do, we had this sort of situation in Australia where policymakers, those with discretionary power, were so much more open to try new things than usual, rather than speaking down to communities and telling them what to do. They were actually listening. They co-designed some incredibly effective responses to control the spread of COVID throughout remote parts of Australia. So much so that while people initially thought that COVID would rip through those communities, in fact, what we found was it actually spread more slowly within those communities. So, yep, this is the point. We do know how to do this stuff, but the political will to do it, the bureaucratic will to do it, that's not always there. But, yep, West Australia can really stand proud on that one.
Okay, I've got another question from Chris this time. How do we fix the problem with rental affordability for low-income working households? Recent research showed that rents went up faster in our older, poorer suburbs with poorer quality housing.
Yeah, all right. Well, this is the increasingly million-dollar question. I have a very old-fashioned answer, and I'll just take a bit of a long run-up at it. But there's this thing in Australia called the Defence Housing Authority, and there's a hint in the name. It provides housing to people who work in defence, and it's effectively a government-owned property developer. What they do is they buy land. Stick with me, this is really complicated. They buy land, they build houses on it, and then they rent the houses to people who work in the Defence Force. It's really tricky. I know that sounded complex. Let me just try again. They buy land, they build houses on it, they rent it to people who work in the Defence Force. It's been going for decades, and guess what? It runs at a profit because, anyone that's paid any attention to the rich list in Australia, or anyone that's paid any attention to their community, will know that property development is actually a really profitable thing to do in Australia. And indeed, it's kind of weird that the only people in Australia that don't want to get into property are our state and federal governments. Everyone else thinks it's a way to make money. Our governments have convinced themselves, or convinced us, that it's a way for governments to lose money, except that the one time they do it, the Defence Housing Authority, they make a profit doing it. So here's a crazy idea. What if we had the Nurses Housing Authority, or the Teachers Housing Authority, or stick with me because this is really complicated, what if we had the Housing Authority? What if the Australian government built houses and rented them to people who needed them? The problem is no one would get rich doing this. Property developers wouldn't get rich. The superannuation funds don't get to make whatever their return is. We know how to build houses and rent them to people. It's just not complicated. And you know what they do in other countries? They build houses and they rent them to people. And when Queen Elizabeth came to Australia in the 1960s, we actually took her and showed her high-rise public housing because we're so proud of public housing in those days. We're like, oh, look, Queen, look what we did. We did a nice thing. Well, you can't do that in Australia anymore. So I don't think there's any silver bullet for housing. We've created a tax system that makes housing a very attractive thing for some people to invest in. So we should look at negative gearing, and we should look at the capital gains tax regime. But in reality, I think if we're having trouble getting the kind of houses we want built in the places we want and rented to the people that we want to get them, there's a really simple thing called public housing. And unfortunately, in Australia, we've stigmatised that incredibly, brackets, except for the defence personnel who don't feel embarrassed to live in a public house, or except if you're a vice chancellor who earns $1 million a year, oh, we'll throw in a house for you, or except if you're the Prime Minister or the Governor General. So it's okay when the defence personnel or some of the richest Australians get public housing. I think we need to. I think we really need to go back to basics on that.
Thank you. Chris is a supplementary one. He says, good idea. We now have huge superannuation funds full of money of workers. Surely they should be building housing for these workers as a way of building their wealth for retirement. You got a comment on that one?
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily follow. Yeah, we could make the superannuation funds do that. We could. But, I can borrow money to build a house. Anyone can borrow money to build a house. The Commonwealth government could borrow money to build a house. The state governments could borrow money to build a house. That would be the cheapest way of doing it. I promise you the government can borrow at a much lower interest rate than you and I. I promise you the government can borrow much cheaper than the superannuation funds will the return they would demand on investing in the houses. So to be clear, we could do it through the super funds. We absolutely could. But the cheap thing would be to do it ourselves. The cheapest way to do it would be for the government to borrow money for a couple of percent less than you and I would ever pay for it, and go to the same subcontractors and use the same plans, get the same things built, and if we're not sure we can do it, well, we'll just ask the Defence Housing Authority to do it.
I've got another question here. Is it your sense that we are on a path towards market-driven services, more like the US, or are you optimistic that there's still a chance for a shift in the political will towards more significant funding for public services?
Well, we are on a path towards private delivery. Whether we stay on the path or not is up to us. It is a democracy. We can vote for change, but the thing with privatisation is because some groups make so much profit out of the privatised result, they're willing to spend a lot of that profit or that potential profit lobbying to convince us that no other options are available. So, I think we need to understand that the best school system in the world, Finland, all the studies over decades said the Finnish school system's the best in the world. There's no private schools in Finland. None. So here we are in Australia, convinced that we're in some struggle to understand how to get a really good education system. But of course, we're just going to ignore the best available information. Similarly, the countries that have the best health systems in the world and in turn have the longest life expectancies and in turn have the lowest gaps between vulnerable groups and wealthy groups in life expectancy and access to health, guess what? They're the Nordic countries again, those Northern European countries that collect more tax than us and spend more money on services than us. So the problem we have in Australia is we kind of have a policy debate that starts with, let's rule out that we'll do the smart thing. Let's rule out that we'll do the thing that the evidence says work. How can we improve the system we've got? And then given that we've ruled out change in most directions, it's no surprise that people conclude that we need to go a little bit further down the privatised path. But yeah, all the data makes quite clear that the good way, the cheap way, the efficient way, and the fair way to provide essential services is to do it through the public sector or some combination of the public sector working with not-for-profits for some service delivery. But flipped on its head, if you want to sort of track the spectacular failure of privatisation in Australia, just look at what we've had royal commissions into: aged care, disability care, in some countries, foster and other care for young people, water down the Murray. Even the Banking Royal Commission was just a royal commission into the abject failure of deregulation. So, we've got 20 years of good data on how this stuff winds up, yet we still have a political class and a policy-making elite who just love kind of outsourcing responsibility, because they don't outsource their own salary. They just outsource any responsibility for the quality of the service.
Thank you. So Nancy from WACS makes the observation, in WA we do have the government regional officers housing, which is we call GROW, system for teachers, police, etc. Some spot purchases and rentals. Health is exempt and runs its own accommodation scheme, some owned and some rentals, but no funding for building new and minimal for maintenance, mainly rentals. And then she makes the point, NGO staff have to find their own housing, which can be very challenging. Nancy, I don't know if people want to also ask come online and ask a question. Did you want to make a further comment on that, Nancy? That putting you on the spot?
Maybe we'll... No, so I'm just trying to unmute. Yeah. So it was just with what Richard was saying around government building houses for government. We kind of have a scheme like that in WA, but it doesn't certainly address all the needs, particularly of the non-government sector and the ACCHO sector, and it doesn't really address the needs for our health employees now, because we haven't got any funding to spot purchase or build new accommodations. So it's kind of it's there, but it's not as you were describing it, Richard, in terms of government investing in new builds for its workers and for its contracted workers, like our contracted non-government sector.
Yeah. And look, just quickly, I mean, we have very rapid population growth in Australia. We have difficulties with finding affordable, appropriate housing. Yeah, as you say, not just for government employees, but for people working in civil society, and of course, people suffering disadvantage in these communities. So it's really quite obvious that we need to spend a lot of money building a lot of houses for a lot of people. The kind of weird thing for me as an economist is listening to people kind of suck air over their teeth and wonder, how will we ever afford to do this? It's like, well, everyone else in the country thinks if they don't borrow money to buy a house, they'll be poor. Yet we've convinced ourselves that if the federal government borrowed money to buy houses, it would make them poor. So, if you're borrowing money to buy good assets and you're putting people in them that will help solve social problems, at worst case scenario, absolute worst case scenario, all you did was solve a housing shortage for people. Most likely scenario, you'll solve a housing shortage for people and wind up with an enormous stock of valuable real estate assets in 20 or 30 years' time. It's not. I just don't get what people are scared of.
Verity, you might want to you've put a comment in the chat saying depends what you do with your vote and the conversations you have to ensure everyone you know understands how they can change the system. Did you want to expand on that?
Oh, I was more just making a comment, in regards to the political inaction, for just the general commentary on what's being said, is that, if people are not making the right decisions by the regions or anybody in fixing these problems, we need to make sure that people understand that that there is ways forward to fix these problems. But it's just that political will and, the knowledge I have with health promotion, it's just that, we need to empower people to know that their vote can influence what happens at the political level. So that it was more just a commentary. It wasn't so much asking a question.
Look, thanks, Verity. I think you're so right, and the point you're making is so important. And the way that I kind of often make that point is to say that democracy thrives on high expectations. Like we can't expect to get our elected representatives to make good decisions that we're really proud of if they've convinced us that we won't be able to do anything. Thanks for voting for me, but I won't really be able to fix anything because we're broke and government's a bit crap. But I'm trusting that you can go fix it. You go do you, Verity. I'm just the treasurer. I can't really do much. So, we really need to have high expectations of our elected members of parliament. I don't mean in a naive, thank them for anything they're doing sense. I mean in a, no, I put you there for a reason and you better get stuff done or I won't keep you there. It's a longer conversation about, where Australia's democracy, I think, is a bit stuck at the moment, but it's partly stuck with political parties sort of convincing themselves and voters that, sure, I won't be able to do much, but I'm better than the other lot. You can see why people would tune out of democracy if that's really the pitch. I'm not very good, but I'm better than them. So democracy is really important. We are a really rich country. We have huge potential to solve huge problems here in Australia and indeed to help other countries around the world should we want to. We should have robust democratic debate about how to do that. We disagree with different people about what the priorities should be. I'm all for disagreement, but the low expectations, that's what's really killing democracy, is the implicit or even explicit assertion that we can't really expect much from our government. I think one of the for me, I've been lucky enough to spend quite a bit of time in the Nordic countries, the Scandinavian countries, and one thing that comes out both in conversation but in opinion polls over there is that everybody, an overwhelming percentage of people in Nordic countries really expect whoever is in power to make good decisions that are in the nation's interest. They really have high expectations, not just of the party they vote for, but of anyone that winds up in Parliament. They see parliamentarians as their servants that are there to help, and they really punish politicians who overtly put their short-term political considerations ahead of what the country wants.
So can I just, there's some more questions here I'll get back to, but can I just jump in there and go, how do the Nordic people, how are they able to keep their politicians continuing those programs, those social programs, and how do they not get away with what politicians in Australia and other, in England and the US get away with?
Look, great question. And there is no simple answer to it, including one of the simplest answers you'll hear is that it's because they're kind of ethnically homogenous, that they're all kind of tall and white and blonde, and therefore they can all do this. I mean, that explanation doesn't hold any water. It's not very logical. But you'll often hear conservatives in Australia who want to lower our expectations about democracy. It's clever, really. They kind of blame migrants for ruining white people's democracy. The reason we can't have a good democracy is because we're not all white and homogenous. Well, that's not true at all. So I do think that culturally they have these high expectations. They have high trust. They have high trust in each other. They have high trust in institutions, and they have a more sophisticated, arguably, understanding of politics than the version that counts for public debate in Australia. And I'm going to say that's because their media is a lot better than ours. I think that, you know, the Murdoch press in Australia and the UK and the US has done enormous damage by setting out to divide people, by setting out to report stories in a way that sets people at odds with each other. New Zealand is similar to Australia in many ways, but its politics are quite different from ours. It was the Conservatives in New Zealand that introduced a carbon tax, for example. What's so different about New Zealand and Australia? Well, one big one is they don't have a Murdoch press. Another different one is that they have a parliamentary system that is kind of built around power sharing. They have quite a unique unicameral government, which sort of simultaneously elects some people like a House of Reps and some with proportional representation, and sort of, you know, compromise is kind of built into their parliamentary structure. So, and you find a bit of that. Not all the Nordic countries have the same parliamentary system, but their parliamentary system kind of expects and rewards compromise. Sounds odd, but in Australia, we've been led to believe that majority government is the only way to get stable, good policy making. And almost everywhere else in the world operates with what we would call chaos and instability. But really, I think what they have are parliamentary systems that require compromise. And, you know, I said at the outset, I'm from Canberra, in the People's Republic of the ACT. We've had a stable Labor-Green minority government for, I think, 17 years, maybe 18. So we're kind of told these stories about how democracy must work, but the stories don't hold much water. And I just think that in the Nordic countries, particularly because they speak their own languages and have their own local media and they can't import all this sort of nonsense, I think they've been able to hang on to that. They've both been able to avoid the Murdoch onslaught directly, but they've also kind of kept a diverse media that keeps telling positive stories about what they could do.
There's a comment here about corporate money, electoral differences. Verity's outlining a few, and emphasising some of the points you've made. Less individualised culture, even city design to create thriving communities. But she's also made a point about, is there no corporate money in government in Nordic countries?
Look, I confess I'm not an expert on Nordic donation reforms, but if someone sends me an email, I'll get back to you with a good answer. The Australia Institute hosts a number of, our own sort of centres, and one of them is the Nordic Policy Centre. We're particularly interested in bringing an awareness of the radical differences in policy making in those countries into Australia. So often in Australia, once upon a time, we compared ourselves with Japan or China. Increasingly, it's the US, and it's like we must do it like them. Well, actually, the richest, happiest, most long-lived people with the best education in the world literally are the Nordic countries, and we think maybe we could learn some lessons from them. So I don't know the actual answer. I don't doubt for a minute that we have undue corporate influence in Australia. I don't doubt that for a minute. I don't doubt that corporate donations play a role in that, and I think that reforms to donations to make it harder or even impossible for corporations to donate to major political parties would probably be helpful. But I don't think for a minute that if we got donations out of Australian politics, that we would solve some of the problems we face. To give you a sense of this, the major parties get around $60 million from public funding for their elections, 60 million. The fossil fuel companies might give 250,000, 350,000. Now, that seems like a lot of money to you and I, but as a percentage of the total budget of the major political parties, it's tiny. But what's interesting is if I give 250 grand to Labor and I give 250 grand to the Libs, I haven't even helped either of them, right? Because they're going to fight each other with my money. All I'm really doing is buying myself a little bit of extra access. I'm reminding them, hey, I'm around, I'm someone, but I don't believe for a second that if I could raise 10 million bucks and give it to the Liberals tomorrow in exchange for them taking a good climate policy to the next election, I don't believe for a second if I got them 10 million bucks, which would be by far the biggest donation they've ever received, I don't believe for a second that they would go, oh, fair point, Richard, I'll take the cash and I'll listen to you. So it's very complicated. I think in Australia, there's a very complicated inside baseball revolving door, back scratching. There's a lot of bad stuff that I'm really worried about. And I think donations are a small part of that. But, and again, I've got no problem with stopping corporate donations or capping corporate donations. That'd be fine. But what the major parties are working on right now is a model to increase public funding for them and make it harder for minor parties and independents to raise money. They're actually going to use donation reform as a way to crush new entrants. They're going to make it harder for the so-called teals to raise money and run against them. So yes, we need to improve donations, but I think we have to be very careful at how we come about designing that. But at the same time, I'd say a federal corruption watchdog is going to scare a lot of people. I think it's going to be really good. I think we need ministerial diaries to be public at a federal level, like they are in many states and most countries. I think we need to have FOI laws that public servants actually take seriously. I think we need to think how we're going to retrain the public service to take obeying the law seriously. So I think a lot of transparency reform is really important. Let's find out what those donations are buying, if that makes sense. Like if the donations are working, let's give ourselves the power to see what's been purchased.
Rebecca asks, getting back to the regions, can you comment on how the universities could be better serving the region, particularly in Western Australia, the regions, I should say, particularly in Western Australia, and perhaps if there are good models for how we could better access outside of Perth?
Yeah, look, I don't have a good answer to that question. I think West Australia is a very large territory with very low population density outside of its capital cities. I think it faces unique challenges globally, not just within Australia. The thing that I'd be cautious, and I think some Australian universities do some things very well. I think unis are really struggling in Australia to kind of define what their role is. But I think their role is to help educate the Australian population and to facilitate research to help Australians better understand themselves and the world they're surrounded by. And unfortunately, the things that vice chancellors typically focus on these days are financial indicators and also sort of status indicators for where their research is getting, where their staff's research is getting published in global journals and things. And let's be clear, by definition, all of Australia's unis can't be Australia's best uni. All of Australian universities can't be the best universities in the world. But gee, you'd think every university in Australia could really be an incredible resource for the community they happen to find themselves in, or they could establish campuses in parts of the country that would really make a big difference. So I think that if universities wanted to provide much more hands-on, in-person education out in remote parts of Australia, it would be a wonderful thing. I think they would attract staff to parts of Australia or the world that academics might never go to. I can see so many synergies for universities having a bigger physical presence in less densely populated parts of Australia. But given most universities focus on, as I said, money and status indicators, I don't see any unis jumping at that in the near future. I think it would be a real pity if we convinced ourselves that remote delivery meant that people, no matter where they lived, could get the same quality education as people in the cities. I just don't believe that's true. I did an undergrad degree, I did an honours degree, I've done a PhD, I've lectured economics at multiple universities over decades. I think there are advantages in in-person education. I don't think a remote education is of no value. I'm not saying, and for some people it might be ideal, but I think we have to be really careful not to tell ourselves that as long as we've offered an online option, that's good enough. That's not how rich people in cities think, and it's not how people who run the best unis in the world think. So we have to be really careful to convince ourselves that as long as it's offered online, that's enough.
I've got one from Hannah. So what do we do as individuals, as services, and as a peak body to help ensure our regions have the resources they need to thrive? Just an easy one.
Look, I think there's a couple of things that you have to do. You have to help these communities stay visible within the policy community and within the broader community. You need to be a voice for them, because it's very hard for people a long way away with less resources to make themselves heard. So being that voice is really important. And to be that voice is resource intensive. I understand that. To have those grounded relationships with those diverse communities is not easy. So I think there's the voice part. And then there's the storytelling part. I really think that most Australians want to live in a fairer, nicer Australia. I think most Australians want their governments to deliver high quality services to everyone, including themselves, but not just themselves. And I think we have to help Australia understand that many of the choices that have been made in the last couple of decades have led to worse outcomes. We're not going in the right direction. We haven't, despite all the political rhetoric, we haven't closed the Indigenous life expectancy gap. We're not on track to do so. We're not offering the primary and preventative health services in remote communities that people would believe that we are and think are desirable. So I think an uncomfortable part of answering your question is we have to be honest to some extent. Civil society has to hold a mirror up to the country and help, or the state, and help people understand what we're really doing. And this is my hobby horse. I may or may not convince you, but it's one thing to say we need to spend more money on nice things. It's another thing to say we're going to need to collect more money, or we're going to need to take money off some other group, because the deficit mentality, the shortage mentality is used to stifle both the enthusiasm and ambition of NGOs and the community itself, who think, well, we need to get our finances sorted before we can afford to have nice things. I understand the sentiment of that, but as I said, we're about to drop a lazy $300 billion on tax cuts. No one said we had to repay the debt before we can give rich people tax cuts. We're about to buy $350 billion worth of submarines. No one said, we have to repay the debt before we can buy the submarines. So I hate to say it, I think a lot of progressives take all this stuff too seriously and actually believe that the policymaker saying, I'd like to help, but we need to get the finances sorted first. It's nice to believe these people, but the brutal reality is they're often just lying to your face.
Can I just then follow that up with a question in terms of politicians will go out to the bush and go out to the regions and say, we hear you. So I heard what you said about keeping the pressure up, is there an argument for building a stronger case for where we should be investing? And as we've already discussed, also, it's not just in one area; it's in a range of areas. How do we? No, it looked like you were going to say something, but I think a lot of some of the questions that are coming in now, because I can see another one saying, how do we build up our good sustainable regional economies so we can have nurses and childcare workers living and thriving? And there's another one around building the business case for individual groups that are passionate in working in housing and health, etc. This has been going on for a long time. We know that you've just given us some stats around how behind a lot of the regions are, particularly First Nations peoples. We're having the arguments about closing the gap. Are there key? And you were saying this morning when we were talking about part of campaigning and achieving things is actually having someone in opposition or having an opposition to your argument. Is that what we need in the regions? Is that, do we need to? Because what we're seeing at the moment is there's agreement that we need more investment in the regions, but we're not getting it.
Yeah. So my favourite book on political strategy is called Hardball, and it's written by a former advisor to a Democrat politician. And there's a chapter in Hardball called Always Agree in Principle. And this is a book written for politicians, like how to be good at politics. And there's a whole chapter on always agree in principle. And that is when someone says we need to spend more money in regional areas to overcome these disadvantages, just agree in principle. Just go, yeah, we sure do, and then leave, right? And most people will remember that you agreed, and they won't really focus on the fact that you didn't do anything about it. So, I know this sounds cynical, and I like politicians. I like democracy. You can't have democracy without politicians. But if politicians get lots of pressure to do one thing and some polite requests to do another thing, I promise they'll respond to the lots of pressure group, not the it'd be nice if you could group. So here we are, one of the richest countries in the world, living at the richest point in world history. Everyone in Western Australia. I went out for a nice walk this morning and walking through the bush, and the bush is brought to me and sponsored by Rio Tinto, because obviously the trees wouldn't be there if Rio Tinto hadn't funded the trees and sponsored the trees. But the simple truth is Australia is the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, the world's largest exporter. And the second largest exporter, Qatar, collects 20 times more tax than we do. 20 times more. We export more gas than them. They collect 20 times more tax than us. Well, frankly, if the resources industry paid some more tax, maybe they wouldn't have to sponsor all the, everything they feel like sponsoring in high-profile areas. The reality is when a government agrees in principle that we should spend more on your group, but then in practice goes and cuts taxes for someone else and doesn't spend more on your group, then they're not helping you. They're not your friends. Or even if they believe you, they're not actually winning a fight in cabinet on behalf of you. So, I just think the how question needs to be to firmly, politely, but painfully highlight what the priorities of people with discretionary decision-making power are doing. Because if they can afford to build a stadium, but they can't afford to build a hospital, they could afford to build a hospital. They just wanted to build a stadium. If they can afford to cut taxes, but they can't afford to invest in Indigenous disadvantage, then they didn't want to, right? So you always got to look at what they do. Sadly, you can't just take seriously what they say.
Does anybody have any more questions? Just looking in the chat. I want to ask one verbally.
We've wowed them, Rach.
Yep. Thank you. If I'm going to wind us up if there's no more questions. Thank you very much, Richard. Really appreciate it. I didn't get that email that you sent through. Oh. So, oops, I've got one more message here by the looks. If you could send it, we'll send it out to the participants.
Yeah, great. All right. Well, I'll check my sent box, but I'll get it to you as soon as I hang up.
Fantastic. Thank you. We're getting some thank yous. So thank you very much, Richard. Really appreciate it. Hi, folks. Thank you very much for participating. I hope you got a lot out of our discussion, and let's keep working for the regions.